Hello, my name is Larry Merkuliev. I'm an Aleut, born and raised on St. Paul Island. I'm the Deputy Director for the Alaska Native Science Commission, and I was the science advisor for the Commission conducting contaminant surveys throughout 5 regions of Alaska a couple of years back. and I had a traditional upbringing and about 20 years of grounding in Western science. One of the key questions that always comes up is, what are the risks and what are the benefits? And then you'll hear this term risk assessment that's used by the scientists. And really that comes to the very guts of what people in the villages want to know. You know, how safe is the food to eat? And the information we get, is it going to tell us what are the risks of eating this food or that food, and what are the benefits from it? It is a frequent question about that we get from individuals who say, well, how do I know if this food is safe to eat and I'm eating 100 pounds of salmon every year? and I think that it depends on the species, what information you've got on it, and what the alternatives are. I think one of the benefits that we have in Alaska and a lot of the areas is that we have multiple kinds of fish species. For example, we've got whitefish, we've got sheefish, we've got codfish, halibut, salmon, and so where there's indication or concern, what you can do is moderate your take by using alternative wild foods in its place. And you know, traditional foods to all Alaska Natives are so important. We consume 420 pounds per capita of wild foods in Alaska. Probably the most amount of wild foods consumed by indigenous peoples anywhere in the United States, and probably of any peoples in the United States. And so it comes down to a question of, you know, what's safe to eat, what's not safe to eat, and people are so concerned about it. I recall an issue, for example, in southeast Alaska where they were looking at the discharges from these cruise ships that were coming out there, and they had something like 160 cruise ships that come through in small villages in Alaska, and they dumped an estimated 150,000 gallons of wastewater and 7,000 gallons of oily bilge. And you know, to the Western scientists that comes out there, they might take a look at that as, you know, what is the impact on the marine system, what's the impact on particular animals, but they don't follow through in terms of, you know, from there, what is going to be the impact on the people or the individuals who might be eating the seals that might be running through these contaminated areas. And so that's one of the things that I think is generally lacking when they look at risk assessment. And even then, if they did study it, whether or not they're looking at the right kinds of issues to assess risk. For example, the amount of contamination that's in a harbor seal when it's killed, and assessing their tissues is one thing. But then when it's taken and cut up by the hunter and then taken home and started to be washed and then prepared for baking or boiling, I mean, all these different ways of cooking, that affects the contaminant loads that are in these tissue. And that's probably not looked at when we start talking about food safety. And also to take a look at the effects, the psychological effects in the community when there is a known contamination that occurs. I mean, when we had the Exxon Valdez oil spill, even today, 17 years later, the people in a lot of the villages are kind of leery of wanting to eat particular kinds of foods, especially ones that are near the shoreline. And that they tell us about how that has ripple effects throughout the entire community, over an entire generation. And if somebody or if a group of people stop hunting or fishing a key species that they normally take and use, that affects whether or not there's the contact between the younger and the older person in the hunting or gathering effort, and if that connection is severed because people are not collecting anymore or harvesting anymore, that information and way of knowing could be lost in a single generation. It can really create havoc in the villages. I'm thinking, for example, out on St. Paul Island, when because sea lions declined by 80%, and the fact that we're self-regulating so the experienced hunters don't go out, it severed the link between the younger men and the older men. And for the next decade after that, I believe, we had really major sociological and community wellness and individual wellness issues that came up, particularly with young men that didn't have the kind of grounding that is brought by having an older and younger hunters together. So it really does have major impacts. If our foods aren't safe, they can really affect the very core of not only our cultures, but community wellness, economics, and individual wellness. That kind of risk is never assessed, I think, generally in these risk assessments, and it's really a critical point. And then, of course, there's no assessment on the effects on local economies. I mean, 420 pounds per capita per person of wild foods has a monetary value, and if some of those foods are gone, what are our alternatives, and what do we go to? And when we go to something else, like going to store-bought foods, what are we eating? And how much of it are we eating? And what kinds of things are we eating? Because many of the store-bought foods today, we know, they have a lot of sugar, they have a lot of salts, they have a lot of chemicals that are in these things that are to preserve them, and that can have real effects compared to wild foods. And then another aspect, I think, that also poses a challenge for the Western scientists that affects our people in the villages is that the scientists really do not know the effects of small amounts of contaminants or toxins that are in the tissue over a long period of time, and particularly with any particular village. I mean, the people in the village, there's a variation about how much, like my daughter won't eat as much seal meat as I do, and and so each individual and each age group consumes a different amount of wild foods. And the entire community, from community to community, they would eat different levels and different types and different quantities of food. And all of that really needs to be assessed in terms of trying to figure out, is it safe to eat or is it not safe to eat? And when we look at it, since scientists do not know and they cannot tell us what small amounts of contaminants or toxins in the animal tissue, what kind of effects that would have on our health over a long period of time, then it comes down to trying to make the best decisions that we can. We've got to push for more studies on these individual wildlife and plants. I mean, plants are rarely studied in terms of toxins, and the medicinal use of plants are rarely studied in terms of what's being consumed and what kind of contaminants or toxins are in them. That all of these things puts the individual in a position in the village to try to decide, is this safe to eat or is this not safe to eat? For sure, on the outside, the Food and Drug Administration or EPA or any of these agencies that are involved in assessing this will tell us what quantities that they find in samples that are taken out there, but they're ultimately not going to tell us whether or not it's really safe. But when I look at it, and when other people look at it, everything so far in our studies indicate that the contaminant and toxin levels in most of the wild foods are very low compared to national standards and what's safe and what's not safe. Very low. And given that, and given the alternative of going to what I consider to be very poisonous foods in the stores, these processed foods, the wild foods are by far the safest thing to eat and the best thing to eat nutritionally. When we compare the nutrition of wild foods to store-bought foods, it's like night and day. I mean, they're just very, very different. And wild foods are by far superior. One of the things that people from the outside don't know are the benefits of traditional foods. And of course, our people do know the benefits of traditional foods. One is that it's natural and wild, and so they don't have the pesticides and the hormones and antibiotics that processed foods that have. It's really is the center of passing along cultural ways, values, and ethics, because when I go out sea lion hunting, for example, I will be bringing along a young person, and they can see how we men would cooperate with each other in the hunt, and how we would share what we take, and how there's no competition between each other. And so the collection of traditional foods and harvesting of traditional foods is very, very important in passing along traditional ways. In addition to that, it's very important in terms of understanding the environment. The way that the elders understood it is being out there day after day and observing and listening to the stories of their elders and listening to the stories of people around the community about what's been going on. So they learn they have an intimate understanding of their environment and of the wildlife. And if our young people lose contact with that, we're going to lose a central core of our cultures. And that could begin by loss of traditional foods or stopping the collection of traditional foods in the villages. One of the other kind of key important aspects of harvesting of traditional foods and sharing in the villages is that it helps to keep the communities and individuals and families together. You know, through extended family feasts, through community celebrations. I mean, having traditional foods in these kinds of gatherings are so important in keeping people together as a community and as extended families. Science really doesn't have a clue. Particularly on low dosages and the synergistic effects of all these different chemicals coming together over a long period of time and under different environmental circumstances, different eating circumstances. I mean, I don't think science will ever really answer the question of whether or not ultimately a food is safe or not safe at low indications of low levels of chemicals. You know, at high levels, of course, we know, you know, if it's high PCBs, then we know it's high PCBs and it's not safe to eat. But at the very low levels, I don't think that these scientists will ever have the answer. So we're going to have to answer it ourselves by evaluating the good and the bad, and so what will I be sacrificing if we all stop as a community eating this particular seal? What's going to be the effect on individuals? What's going to be the effect on going to the store and having store-bought foods? And what's going to be the effect on our economy? And, you know, there needs to be community decision-making. I think when we come to a situation of uncertainty, when we don't know what is going on, then get the elders together and get the hunters and fishers and gatherers together and talk about what happens. Yes, we don't know whether or not this is safe. What happens if we give it up to our health, to our economy, to our culture, and to individuals, and to community wellness? And so ultimately, I think the decision is going to have to be made by the community.